I took my first trip to a national park. You can imagine we live in Uganda where tourists come from all over the world to visit amazing places right here. But for some reason, I was approaching 40 and I had never been to a national park. Where am I going with this? While we were on that trip in the national park, looking at these beautiful animals, looking at the beautiful landscape and all that, one of the friends we were traveling with asked the tour guide a question. So she asked about the boundaries around the national park, and then she asked if the animals are forcefully contained or if there's someone watching to see if they've crossed over and gone to the nearby towns or whatever. And the tour guide said, for some reason, the animals just know where their space ends, for lack of a better word. They actually know where the boundaries are and they do not go beyond. Some of them don't necessarily know where the boundaries are, but for some reason, all their lives, these animals will stay, cordoned in. And it's very rare that the guides or the wardens or the people looking after these animals and making sure that this place is safe, it's very rare that they'll worry about these animals crossing over to go to spaces where, people live within that vicinity. And our friend exclaimed, she couldn't believe it, but I also started to think about it and I could not believe that animals that had to live, some animals will live for years and years. So let's say an animal that was almost my age in there, whether it's an antelope or whatever, it's been there for years. And for some reason, it just stays within its vicinity. Another thing we noticed was that the king of the jungle, the lion, and, the lionesses and all that, they had these little areas that were their sections, yeah? It reminded me a little bit of Lion King. So they had these sections that were theirs, and you could see the other animals on the outskirts knowing that they were not supposed to cross over and enter a particular space. So when I thought about that and the fact that we knew the boundary lines around the park because as we moved, we were being shown, and we were later going to drive out of the park and actually be on the outskirts of those boundaries. As I thought about that, I thought about one of my favorite scriptures, which is Psalm 16. In Psalm 16, David is praying. He's praying and he's talking to God. And we cannot get, little parts and look at them out of context. It's important to look at them within the context. So he's praying and he's talking to God and he's saying, God, you love me. God, thank you. He's saying all these things to God. And then at some point he says, you're, the enemies of God, they'll suffer whatever. But he goes on to say that in verse 5, he goes on to say that, I think it's verse 5 or 6, but let me just confirm that. He's praying to God and he says, God, preserve me. I trust you. It's only you I trust. And then he says, those who run after other gods, are sad and all that. He says that. And they'll suffer. And then he comes to verse 6 and he says, the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I love this whole scripture because verse 11, which is also another favorite of mine, ends by saying, at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. But what I was thinking about with this scripture, and it's always important to read the whole thing, I was thinking about that scripture, verse 6, that says the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. And I was thinking how God has hemmed us in. He has put a hedge of protection around us. He has protected us. And within the space of protection where God has put us, where he has said that this is where you're going to live, this is where things are going to happen for you. And these are not actually physical boundaries, but they are, for lack of a better word, spiritual boundaries, where we sometimes think we are confined, but in actual sense, we are not confined. And I don't want to claim that this is the perfect interpretation of that scripture, but in my musings and every time I sit to think about the boundary lines, I think about the fact that God has a plan for me that he has carved out within certain boundaries. And many times I feel like I want to step out of those boundaries because within those boundaries seems boring. It seems limiting. I want to do all sorts of things. Sometimes I want to do something at a particular time and I feel like he's saying no. And I've discovered that when we say the boundary lines are fallen for me in pleasant places, it means that where God has hemmed us in, where he has protected us, within that are pleasant places. Within that is joy. Within that is healing. Within that is knowing that even if I go through hard times, he's going to come through for me. It doesn't mean things are perfect, but it means that within his plan for me, I can actually live a very full life. I can live a life that is full of joy. And I am so blessed by that. So I love to think of what the pleasant places are. And I'm calling on you to think of what the pleasant places are. When you say the boundary lines are falling for me in pleasant places, what are those pleasant places for you? Within where God has enclosed us, we will be able to experience pleasant places. We'll be able to experience pleasures, even if we have to experience pain at times. And I'm not oblivious to the fact that sometimes life can be really painful, but I know that if we stick within the boundary lines that he has drawn for us, God is going to bring us through. He's going to bring us through those moments. And so today I just want to encourage us to think about the boundary lines and where God has marked for us to live out our lives beautifully to the day when he comes back and we shall be like him. I'm so blessed by that. And that day my mind was blown to imagine that in that national park, these animals, they'll just stay within their area, and they know that should they step out of their area, there is trouble. They just know that. How about we thought about that and knew it too? So please go on, think about it, and have a blessed day, week, month, whatever it is. If you've fallen on this video, wherever it is, I pray that you will be blessed. Mwah.